Welcome, everybody. We'll give folks a few minutes to get logged in here. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Brittany, speak of the devil. We were just talking about you. Welcome, all. We had quite a few registered folks for this talk, so I'm going to give it just a few more minutes. Let everybody come in. Welcome, everybody. All right. Thanks so much for joining, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome to yet another installation of the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center Science Seminar Series. My name is Michelle Jewell, and I'm the Communications and Engagement Manager here at the Southeast CAS. And our goal at these virtual gatherings is to highlight and discuss research that supports resource management across the Southeast. So we are thrilled to be joined today by Corey Davis and Haven Cashwell from North Carolina State Climate Office. But before they start their talk, I'm going to cover some of the Zoom features that we're using today. We are in a webinar setting, so some of it might look a little bit different on your screen. First, a note that we will be recording today's webinar and we'll post it to our website and our YouTube channel afterwards. If you take a look at your bottom bar there in the middle, you can access the Q&A window and enable closed captions if you'd like to. You can submit your questions as they occur to you during the talk in that Q&A box for discussion. And also a new fun feature is that you can upvote other people's questions, and you too can comment on people's questions if you have additional information for them. We will have a standard Q&A session at the end of our speaker's presentation. I will ask on your behalf any unanswered questions left in the Q&A box. And during the Q&A session, you can also use the raise hand function, and I'll unmute you, and you can ask your question directly to our speakers. Now, Carrie's going to go ahead and launch us a short poll just to get a bit of information about who is with us in the room. I have a strong suspicion I'm going to know the answer to this based off of all of the registration information we had. Welcome, Fisheries and Wildlife Service, to this webinar, and everybody else as well. We'll give you just a few more minutes here to throw your answers in those. We really appreciate your feedback. Lets us know who's here and who's getting our information. Just a few more minutes here, folks. Still see some answers pouring in. All right, great. Wonderful. Thanks so much for sharing that, Carrie. And thank you again, everybody, for giving us that valuable information. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and pass it over to our speakers while I introduce them. Once again, I am absolutely delighted to have Corey Davis and Haven Cashwell here for the Science Seminar Series. Corey is a graduate of NC State University with a bachelor's degree in meteorology and a master's in atmospheric science. He has been with the North Carolina State Climate Office for more than 15 years as a student and staff member. His work includes developing web-based visualizations and decision support tools that give access to weather and climate data, editing and writing the climate blog, we're huge fans of it over here, and that shares the stories of North Carolina's weather and climate, and serving as the office's lead for drought and fire weather. Haven Cashwell is a PhD candidate at Auburn University studying Earth system science. Her research involves enhancing climate resiliency and climate communication with communities in North Carolina and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. She received a master's in geography from Auburn University and a bachelor's in meteorology with a minor in environmental science right here, Wolfpack, NC State. All right, I will turn it over to Corey and Haven. Thanks so much, y'all.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. That was a great introduction. Glad to be here. Glad to be joining everyone this afternoon. Again, I'm Corey Davis. I'll be leading off our talk, and about halfway through, I'll hand over to Haven to talk more about some of the evaluation work that we had done. Just wanted to acknowledge, for starters, that we were not the only two people working on this project. Today, we're representing our colleagues at the North Carolina State Climate Office, at Auburn University, and at CCASC, who are also a big part of this project and getting it to the finish line, where finally we can say that we've made it. And you'll understand why I say finally as we talk about the project background, because this has been a long time in the making. We started planning for this project back in 2019. In fact, I checked my email and I found the first conversation that we had internally in our office about this project was almost 5 years ago exactly. It was 5 years ago in February of 2019. So again, this was a project that the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center brought to us at the North Carolina State Climate Office. And the goal all along has been developing and evaluating a tool that we could show future climate projections that could be used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and their scientists who are studying climate and its impacts on endangered species, specifically in the Southeast region. We'll talk a little more about this guy on the screen, the gopher tortoise here later. He will be an important example for us as we walk through how you can use this tool and some of its applications. Now, I'll mention that I think there's a good reason that CCAS chose the State Climate Office to help with this. I think they like us, but also we had a history of doing visualizations for future climate projections. Probably the best example of that was the Pine Map Decision Support System. This was a project that we worked on 10 to 15 years ago, really kind of the first of its kind. It was funded by USDA. It was dealing with loblolly pine trees across the southeastern United States, and it was geared toward professional foresters who wanted to better understand how climate might affect the loblolly pine trees that they were growing. So the interface that we put together, this PineMap DSS tool, included lots of different weather and climate variables that were related to either future risks or future opportunities for loblolly pine growth. Those included things like the cold tolerance. We know especially young pine trees can be very susceptible to cold damage on those coldest winter nights. Also, as we think about changing precipitation patterns, that can affect water availabilities during some times of the year. So it was interesting to see in this project where across the native range of loblolly pine trees in the southeast may end up having more issues with drought and dryness and water availability. In terms of opportunities, we know that with a warming climate, we may be able to grow some species farther north than we have in the past. So we developed ways to show where you may be able to pull seedlings from and plant farther north without really appreciably increasing that risk of cold damage. I'll show a couple of screenshots of the PineMap tool, mainly just to highlight some of the elements of the interface. And again, for its time, I think it was pretty innovative because instead of just showing the multi-model mean or the average value that was coming out of climate models, we were showing a spread of outcomes. You see this 3-map layout. This is showing in the middle the multi-model mean, but then on the sides, conditions that were 2 standard deviations below and above that mean value. And this really got at one of the requests that we had from the professional foresters that were the main audience for this project. They wanted to better understand what the spread of likely future outcomes looked like for each of these different parameters. You can tell by the maps that it was very regional in focus, but also we developed ways that folks could see what conditions may look like locally. By clicking on the map, they could look at a specific location, maybe wherever their stand of trees was located, and see what those changes and especially what that range may look like of possible future conditions. So again, this was kind of our first take at developing an interface for viewing projections like this. Another thing that made this PineMap project pretty unique and that kind of served as a template for the CAnVAS project was the pretty rigorous evaluation that it went through. Throughout the project, we had beta testers essentially who were using the tool and providing feedback about certain elements, certain things that we were changing. But also we did some evaluation through eye tracking studies. These are really nifty. They're a nice way of actually putting a user in front of the tool, letting them use it like they would normally, but also while they're using it, you can collect information about how they're using it, where they're looking on the screen. The example image on the right here shows one of the heat maps that came from that project. So you can see the yellow and orange and red areas that show where users were looking most commonly. I'll say one of the things that I've always found the most interesting from eye tracking is not the places where people are looking, but actually where they're not looking on the screen. And you can tell in this example, we had some of these little pink FAQ boxes embedded throughout the page, hoping that for folks that maybe weren't as familiar with using data like this, that they could look at that, and get a bit more information about how to use the tool. What we found through eye tracking is that not many people were looking at those embedded help and tooltips at all. So that kind of made us rethink how we were guiding users through the tool. Now, we don't want to talk too much about the Pine Map tool on this webinar, but I'll note that if you want more information, we do have a paper published in Weather, Climate, and Society that covers our findings, the entire development and evaluation process for this tool. So getting back to the CAnVAS project, again, I went back to one of those very early emails from 5 years ago, and I'm pulling these project goals straight from that email. So today's webinar will be a nice way of seeing if we've actually met those goals through the project. Our first goal was developing a framework for displaying these future climate projections. And I'll explain what I mean by framework. Even back in 2019, we were starting to see really a proliferation of tools online for looking at climate data. So, each tool does things a little bit differently. They may be tailored to a slightly different audience. But what we hoped is that through what we've learned over the years and through the evaluation that we did for this tool, we could develop the basic design of an interface that anybody could use to display climate information and then adapt that as they needed to. So even beyond the lifetime of this project, as new climate model data comes out, they could plug that into a very similar interface and again, expect that users would be able to understand and access that data. For our specific project using this interface, we wanted to select some of the key climate parameters that we know have impacts to endangered and threatened species. And then we were going to identify and pull that based on what the best available science said, again, about impacts to those species. Just like we did with the Pine Map project, we wanted to share not just one single average value for the future, but also really open up that to a range of possible future outcomes, or as we called it here, these plausible scenarios of what future environmental conditions may look like. And then the ultimate goal was putting this tool in the hands of those biologists at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service so that they could use that data to inform their own assessment of climate impacts and threats to endangered species. At the beginning of the project, one of the things we heard is that these scientists really wanted access to this data. They just didn't know where to find it in a lot of cases. So we were hoping that the CAnVAS tool could be one of those places they could come and, again, would be able to use and interpret that data. I'll note that a lot of those assessments happen through this species status assessment process. These are fairly detailed reports that Fish and Wildlife Service put together for these species all across the country, including in the Southeast region. They summarize things like the current populations and habitats and biology of these different species, but also some of the threats for the future. And in each one of these reports, you'll usually find a section about climate, both the climate variables that impact some of these species, but also climate-related threats going forward. This is an example of the report from the gopher tortoise, and you can tell just from the first paragraph here that some of those climate impacts include things like warming temperatures, more frequent drought, changing precipitation intensity during those events. And we'll talk a little bit later about specifically what some of those impacts look like to the species. But again, they can cover a pretty wide range of conditions. Even in this one, you can see sea level rise as mentioned. So unfortunately, that's not one we were able to display with the CAnVAS tool, but it is something that we know that those scientists are monitoring. So with that application in mind of informing the species status assessments, we called the tool we were developing CAnVAS, or the Climate Analysis and Visualization for the Assessment of Species Status. I almost lose my breath saying that, so we'll just call it CAnVAS from here on out. So going back to what we had planned at the very beginning of the project, the timeline was essentially broken into 3 different phases. The first phase would be putting together some image-based mock-ups of what the basic tool design could look like, and then doing some evaluation on those to make sure that users were looking at and understanding that interface and the data the way that we had intended. Through the Pine Map project and some of the other projects that we've worked on at our office, we've realized that doing these mock-ups and making changes based on those is a lot easier than jumping straight into coding up an entire tool and then making changes sometimes when it is kind of a finalized design. So we've used those lessons learned from the past with this project as well. The next step was the development and evaluation part of the project. So we were going to actually start developing a working tool, bringing in that climate projection data. But every time we would do some updates to this tool, we wanted to make sure that was working the way that we had hoped, that users were viewing and interpreting that data the way that we intended. So we wanted to do this iterative development process, doing usability testing with stakeholders, specifically from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And those testing results could inform other changes to the tool. And again, we could go through this process until we got to a tool that folks liked and that was being used the way that we had intended. The final step of the process is basically where we're at now. And that's why I'm really glad to hear we've got a lot of folks from Fish and Wildlife Service on today's webinar. It's the rollout. It's putting this tool in your hands so that you can start to use it as well. Now, I'll note with the timeline, we originally thought that this would be pretty comfortably fit within about a 2-year period. Again, it's taken 5. The biggest reason for that is something that I'm sure we all remember. It was a little nasty virus that started going around 4 years ago. And this really affected every stage of the process. Right about the time that we got those mock-ups developed, again, everything shut down for COVID. So that meant that we really weren't able to go out and meet with a lot of the people that we wanted to do some of that early evaluation. I know especially folks with the federal government had a lot of travel restrictions during COVID. So during the usability testing part, they just weren't able to get to the types of meetings and events that they had planned on being at, or we were planning on being at as well. So as we went along, we had to find some workarounds for meeting with folks, but we'll talk about those as the talk goes on. And again, the rollout part wasn't necessarily affected by COVID, but because of delays earlier in the project, we're just now rolling it out here at the 5-year mark. So I'll start with the mock-ups first. Again, these were all image-based. So this was not a working web page. This was not interactive, so users couldn't click on the screen and change anything. It was just an idea for how the tool could look. In this case, you can see we were showing 3 different weather variables and how those may change in the future on the graph at the top here. And then down at the bottom, we were showing some maps across the region of how one of those variables may look. Now, we developed a couple different versions of this mockup in order to be able to kind of do some A/B testing and see which elements worked well, or at least worked better than the other. So on this version, you can see for the plots, we were using this kind of faded bar where it's the most opaque in the middle around the multi-model mean, and then it fades out to more transparent near those edges, the spreads of the outcomes. Another thing that we tested was the colors that we were using on the map. So in this first mockup, we were using, I guess, more neutral colors, kind of blues and greens going up to the yellows and browns. The other version that we used had different elements there. So instead of the faded bars, it was using more of this box and whisker type display. And then the colors were generally warmer, going from the whites and yellows up to the reds and purples. So all of those were things that by having some users test out one version, other users test out the other version, that we could see which one tended to perform better. And the way that we measured that performance was both by asking users questions. So we would have them work through tasks that made them look at the mockup, whether it was in the plot or the maps to find the answer. And then we could see how accurate their answers were. But also it was by having them in front of an eye tracking equipped computer so that we could see where they were looking on the screen, how long it took for them to get to the answer. And in some cases, if it looked like they were stuck, what they were looking at to try to find and solve that answer as they went on. Now, again, this is something that we had really hoped we would be able to do with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service scientists, but being that it was back in 2020 at the time, with all the restrictions that were in place then, we actually ended up doing this testing with undergraduate science students at Auburn University. That was part of Haven's master's thesis work at Auburn. And we know that those audiences are not exactly the same, but there actually are some similarities. One is that whether you're a biologist or a science student, climate is probably not going to be at least your main area of training and expertise. So when we're showing climate data like this, we knew that we were not necessarily talking to the foremost experts in the field. It was people that had probably looked at it, but maybe were not quite as familiar with that type of data. Another thing is that, again, at least with a basic background in science, folks should be familiar with looking at data in graphical and map-based formats like this. And that was really the goal of testing these mock-ups, is to see how users were looking at and answering questions based on those visualizations. Sure, I'll share here some of the key findings from those mock-ups. Again, some of those were related to the changes that we were specifically testing for. In one case, we actually found that the faded bars were not as effective as the box plots. This was a little surprising because with the Pine Map tool, during that evaluation, we found that faded bars were generally better. They were preferred by the users for that tool. But in this case, again, with more scientifically savvy users, the box plot seemed like it worked better in terms of interpretation and accuracy of the results. Uh, in terms of the color ramp that we used for the maps, that one that went from white to yellow to red to purple was generally a little better. I think it was just a little bit easier to pick out which values were on the low end and which values were on the high end. So we used that color ramp or one similar to it throughout the CAnVAS tool. There was actually one finding that came from this evaluation that we weren't expecting, that we weren't even testing for. And you can see that in the heat maps on the bottom here. We were showing all of the parameters just on a single graph. And we realized based on, again, the accuracy of the question results, but also based on the eye tracking results, that was really confusing for users. They didn't necessarily know what those values they were looking at corresponded to because some parameters were plotted on the left side y-axis and some were on the right side y-axis. And you can see that here. Users were looking a lot at one time period we asked about, but then they were kind of looking equally on both sides to figure out what values went along with what they were seeing on the graph. So that was another change we made for the final tool, was separating each parameter out onto its own plot. So the next step after we had a pretty good idea of how the design should look was selecting which climate variables would be included. And as I'm sure the folks on the call here who are with Fish and Wildlife Service will be aware, this is not as easy as it sounds because a lot of those relationships between climate and species are not direct. They're definitely more indirect. A good example of that is with the eastern hellbender. This is a salamander species that's native to the southeast. It makes its home in a lot of streams across the region. And reading the species status assessment for this species, you can kind of see some of those indirect connections. So it mentions that as air temperatures warm up, that should lead to warming stream temperatures as well. But that in itself may not necessarily cause much change. It's really some of those other changes, like having less dissolved oxygen content or having warmer water be more favorable for fungal pathogens, they can really start to affect the salamander in that case. Another example that's mentioned in that report is that, again, warming temperatures, along with changing precipitation patterns, may cause more evaporation and lower summertime base flows in these streams. And then the report notes that when you have streams that are flashier like this, that in other salamander species, that's been seen to weaken some of their immune function. So again, we can't necessarily say that more evaporation is going to cause this amount of mortality, but we know that there is some connection there between those two things. So in thinking about the variables that we included, we looked at a list of 19 bioclimatic variables that have been put together by the World Climb Group, and we selected some of those that we were seeing coming up over and over in a lot of the species status assessments that we reviewed. Those included things like the annual temperature range and also the daily or diurnal temperature range. Through each season of the year, the average, the maximum, and the minimum temperatures, and then also the number of days per year where you're getting temperatures above or below a certain threshold. We also had some precipitation-based components, including the seasonal average precipitation, and then some drought components, such as when you go through a dry spell, how many dry days in a row do you tend to see? In terms of the data that we were using for this project, it was actually the same data set that we used for the Pine Map project, and there was good reason for that. We were very familiar with this data set and its capabilities. Specifically, it's the MACA data set that was developed out of the University of Idaho, and it includes a set of 20 global climate models that have each been statistically downscaled over the United States. So it's giving us fairly high resolution data across the region that we were interested in. Another thing that we liked about the MACA data set is that it includes not just temperature and precipitation, but also things like humidity and wind speed and radiation. Although those other parameters have not been included in CAnVAS, but certainly there's the potential for doing more work with some of those other variables. And just like we did for the Pine Map project, for each of the variables we were interested in, we calculated both the multi-model mean along with those values that were 2 standard deviations above and below the mean. Again, in the interest of giving an idea of that spread of possible future scenarios. In terms of the time periods that we looked at, we had both historical data and also future projections. The historical data came from the model baseline, which is basically running each of those global climate models over that historical time period using emissions and climate conditions that were typical of that period. So we used a 30-year historical period from 1970 to 1999. And then for the future projections, we divided those into 3 different 30-year time blocks. One of those beginning in 2010 and going through 2039, another running through the mid-century, and then another at the end of the century. And for each of these future time blocks, we were using 2 different emission scenarios, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. So you will see those 2 scenarios presented throughout the tool. So again, based on all we had learned from the mock-ups and that evaluation, along with what we learned from previous tool development, we were able to combine that into the CAnVAS interface. You can see the link here, and we'll walk through an example of that really shortly. But just to set the stage for that example, I wanted to make it relevant to one of these species in the region. So let's go back to the gopher tortoise, this kind of funny looking guy that is actually the only tortoise species that is native east of the Mississippi River. So that in itself makes it kind of unique across our region. You can tell based on the map here where its native range is located across much of Florida, parts of Georgia, Alabama. But on the western extent of its range, especially getting into Mississippi and parts of Louisiana, it is currently listed as a federally threatened species. So you can imagine scientists using CAnVAS may want to investigate what are some of the climate factors that could influence this species' viability in that particular part of the range where it's already threatened due to things like habitat loss. So why are gopher tortoises important to study in the first place? I think this chart shows it really well. This is the sort of sign that's been put up on the beaches where the gopher tortoise burrows to really inform people about its impact on the ecosystem. It's considered a keystone species because the burrows that it digs in the sand are home to not just those tortoises, but more than 300 other species that live in these areas. So you can imagine if we see changes in the habitats of the gopher tortoise, that will also affect all of those other species that live in the same areas. So again, pretty easy to understand why we'd want to understand what changes may happen to the gopher tortoise and how climate may affect that in the future. There's another reason I'm using the gopher tortoise example here, and that's because there is actually a very direct climate sensitivity to this species. Like a lot of other turtles and tortoises, gopher tortoise babies are very sensitive to the temperature in which they're incubated. So looking at the species status assessment for the gopher tortoise from a few years ago, again, you can see that temperature-dependent sex determination, and scientists had determined that a key temperature was about 29 degrees Celsius or about 85 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, they tended to see roughly even numbers of males and females being hatched. As you started getting at temperatures warmer than that, there was a preference for more females being hatched. So we can use the CAnVAS tool to try to explore what those temperatures may look like in the future. So at this point, I will switch over to CAnVAS and we'll walk through an example there. For starters, we'll select a location, and again, looking at that part of the gopher tortoise's range, we may look at somewhere in coastal Mississippi, like the Mississippi National Wildlife Refuge, and use that location. Then we can look at the projections. Again, a whole list of different variables here that we can look at. In this case, we'll look at a couple temperature-focused ones. So maybe we'll start with the average temperatures during the summer season, because we know that the average air temperature does tend to be pretty well correlated with the temperature of the ground, or in this case, the sand. So we'll plot that data, and then you'll see the chart come up here. Again, this is a separate plot for each parameter. You're not going to see that overlapping data like we had on the mock-ups, but you can then see what conditions were like in that historical period, and then also what conditions are expected to look like over each of those future 30-year time periods. Just at a glance, we can tell something pretty interesting and informative, and that's that by this mid-century period, even the multi-model mean values are expected to be near or slightly above that 85-degree critical threshold, and again, seeing even more warming than that by the end of the century. We can also look at this in a tabular format, showing the changes over time compared to that historical average, again, looking at what the historical conditions were, and then in this early century period, seeing maybe 2 to 2.5 degrees of warming of the multi-model mean. By mid-century, more like 3.5 to 5 degrees, and again, even more than that by the end of the century. And again, you can also see what that spread looks like based on the values, 2 standard deviations above and below the mean. These values are also color-coded, so you can easily tell in this case that all of these future values, even on the lower end, on the 2 standard deviations below the mean side, are expected to be greater than that historical average. So again, that gives more confidence in the results that you're seeing, that you for sure can expect to see warming beyond what we've seen historically. We can also click on any of these time periods to load the maps in this climate snapshot section at the bottom. The thing I really like about these maps is that you can get that good regional view of what conditions may look like. In this case, and I think it's especially apparent with this RCP 8.5 scenario, you can see that the warmer conditions in the future are expected to happen on the western extent of that gopher tortoise native range. So that can tell scientists a lot, especially in these areas where they're already a threatened species, that's where they may see even more warming going forward. We can look at another example here, maybe look at the number of days per year where we're expected to see temperatures above that key 85-degree threshold. Again, in this case, we'll see a plot that loads that shows the historical conditions, and then the conditions for each of those 30-year future time periods. We can also look at the summary table there to see what the magnitude of those changes should look like. So historically, on average, seeing about 125 days per year that warm. Even by the early century future period, seeing at least 20 or 25 days that warm, and again, even more by mid-century. So again, this just gives an idea of the data that's available in CAnVAS and how it can be used. I'll go back to the slides now and got an example here of what a synthesized data from CAnVAS could look like. In this case, we're looking at those 2 different parameters that we just viewed. You can see I put the historical average on here, along with the multi-model mean, and then that spread. There's a couple really, I think, useful findings that you could get from this. One of those is that all scenarios for the mid-century and end-of-century period were showing the average summer temperatures above that 84.7-degree threshold that was noted as being important in the assessment report. So again, right there, that could tell you when you may expect to start seeing bigger changes in the sex of the turtles that are hatched. Another change is, again, the number of days that are getting above that 85-degree threshold. I looked at historical climate data for this location along the Gulf Coast. The most number of days they've ever had historically at 85 degrees or warmer is 162. So you can see, based on this future data, that by mid-century and especially the end of the century, no matter which scenario we're under here, we're expecting to see the average annual number of days that warm going beyond the maximum of what we've seen historically. So again, I think that's a pretty powerful finding that shows what these projections are showing and how it could be used in the assessment of a species like this. So with that, I will hand over to Haven to talk about the evaluation that we've done and give some final thoughts from our side. So Haven, it's all yours.
Perfect. Thank you. Let me go ahead and put this in a slideshow. Awesome. So once again, my name is Haven Cashwell. I'm a PhD candidate at Auburn University studying Earth System Science. It's an honor to be here and talk to you all today. Specifically, this evaluation work that we did is a part of my dissertation. So I'm really excited to share some of the results on that with you today. So essentially what I'm going to be talking about is how did we get from those original mock-ups that Corey mentioned earlier between the faded bar and the box plot to this amazing navigational website that he just showed to you. So first, we did usability testing. And so what that was we did eye tracking with the Auburn undergraduates that you saw with the initial standstill images of CAnVAS. And then secondly, we wanted to work with the end user of this product. And so we did eye tracking with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stakeholders, specifically biologists who perhaps work on species status assessments. And so we took the results that we found from those standstill images in that first round of CAnVAS usability testing, made some tweaks, and then ultimately turn this into a navigational tool. The picture that you're seeing on the right-hand side is the equipment that I used for eye tracking. So I was able to travel with a laptop computer and use an eye tracker. You can see it's highlighted in the red box. And this eye tracker just attaches to the bottom of the computer monitor. And so that's how I was able to analyze while participants were looking at the computer screen. That eye tracker was able to track where exactly they were looking and provide me some great data to work with. So with the testing with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist, we kind of did this in two parts. So I did the eye tracking, like I mentioned earlier, and how we did this is we developed 9 different questions or tasks that we wanted participants to answer. For this navigational portion of CAnVAS, we had 3 climate variables that we wanted participants to navigate through. And so we divvied up those 9 questions. So we had 3 questions per climate variable. And what that was, I'll explain more about the tasks in a bit, but the task just generally provided a question that we would like the participants to answer and let the participants have free rein on navigating the website to see if they could find the answer. Once the eye tracking portion of the study was complete, I then conducted interviews with these participants using retrospective verbal protocol. So what I would do is I would play back their eye tracking data, because as soon as it was collected, I was able to gather that and play their data from the very beginning. And so we were able to watch where exactly they were looking. And so from this, I could ask questions, oh, why were you looking in this area versus another? And get a sense of why they may have answered a certain question the way they did. And so those interviews were about 15 minutes upon completion of eye tracking. And this helped also with the usability by providing some information about the satisfaction with the tool as well. So here are some examples of those tasks that we talked about. So the tasks, once again, are broken down into 3 different groups with 3 questions affiliated with each. And so task 1 centered around the climate variable of summer temperature. So essentially what you're seeing down at the bottom is kind of what they would have pulled up on the screen at the time. And so an example question was, which decadal interval has the largest range of projected summer temperatures for RCP 4.5? And so in this, we wanted them to be able to look at the different representative concentration pathways and determine which decade had the largest range in this climate variable. The second group of tasks focused on summer precipitation, so our second climate variable. And an example question from this was, what is the minimum projected outcome for summer precipitation from 2080 to 2099 for RCP 8.5? And then our final grouping of tasks that we developed was around extreme minimum temperatures. And so these group of questions really wanted folks to plot this box and whisker format. However, you saw as Corey demoed earlier that you can click on the box and whisker format and maps show up in the climate snapshot portion of CAnVAS. And so task 3 really wanted participants to focus on that bottom portion of CAnVAS, so the climate snapshot portion, by clicking on these box and whisker plots. And so that's what these questions in task 3 were more so geared towards. So for my sample, I was able to have 15 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stakeholders participate in my study. So I was actually able to do some testing in Gulf Shores, Alabama, when the CCAS Climate Adaptation Science Symposium was held there. I met some individuals there who put me in contact with those at their retrospective Fish and Wildlife Service office. So I was also able to travel to Atlanta, Georgia, in their office there, as well as Daphne, Alabama. And so what's really great about the eye tracking equipment I used is I was just able to pack up my laptop, and the eye tracker that is at the bottom of the laptop screen, and then travel with this equipment to be able to meet the stakeholders where they are, which was a really important thing. And so out of my 15 participants, as far as gender, 53% of those were women, 47% men. Majority of my participants were white, and majority of them had at least a graduate degree. And then as far as the age goes, there was a fairly normal distribution of age, with the peak being in the 40 to 49 age group. And then majority of my participants had worked in their specific field of work for more than 10 years. So that was really interesting to note as well. And so with the eye tracking data, a way that we analyze this data is via areas of interest. So what you're seeing here on the screen right now are different colored boxes, and each box is an area of interest. So an area that I wanted to know more about, wanted to know where participants were looking specifically in this box. And so these areas of interest were really crucial for eye tracking data, because I was able to see how long they were looking in a box, maybe if they didn't look in this specific area for that long, which box they looked in first, things like that. So these areas of interest are how we analyze data and ultimately are going to lead into some of the findings that we discovered. And so with the usability testing with stakeholders, usability can be broken up into 3 different metrics: efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction. And so we used eye tracking to kind of determine efficiency and effectiveness of the CAnVAS tool. So let's first start off by talking about efficiency. And so what I ended up doing was independent sample t-tests were conducted for different eye tracking metrics. So I pulled total fixation duration, so how long participants fixated in certain AOIs versus others; total visit duration, so how long participants visited an AOI, so one of those boxes that I showed on the previous slide; and then time to first fixation, so how long it took for a participant to go to that certain AOI and fixate on it for the very first time. And so some interesting findings came out of those. So with total fixation duration, the climate snapshot portion of CAnVAS, so that bottom portion where the spatially we're showing data, that AOI was not statistically significant for task 2 and task 3. This is really important because for task 3, we wanted participants to look at that bottom portion of CAnVAS, and knowing that participants were not looking there was a really important finding and helped us to develop some more recommendations that I'll get to in a second. For total visit duration, once again, we saw that the climate snapshot area of interest was not statistically significant for task 2 and task 3 once again. For the same reasons, this was really important, as we wanted for task 3 participants to look at that spatial distribution of data. And then for time to first fixation, participants looked at the instructions and the legend before other portions of CAnVAS. The instructions provided the question for the task. So intuitively that made sense because they would have had to look there first in order to plot any sort of data. And the fact that they were also looking at the legend before other portions of CAnVAS was great as well, because that meant they were going straight from the instructions to the legend in order to accurately plot the data. So that was efficiency, the breakdown of those different metrics. So once again, kind of centering you and what CAnVAS would have looked like. You saw earlier Corey hover over one of the RCP box plots, and this pop-up displays, and then you're able to click on the box plot, and then the climate snapshot portion at the bottom shows up. And so for task 3, here's a heat map for all participants for the entirety of task 3, where we wanted participants to look at the bottom portion of CAnVAS. And a heat map is able to show the more red the colors are, the longer the participants look there. The lighter blue to no colors participants look there less, or they did not look in that particular area. So for task 3, once again, we wanted them to focus on this bottom portion, the climate snapshots portion of CAnVAS, and we could see there was not really a concentration in participants looking in that area. So what does that mean for the future? Do we need to provide some instructions, etc.? So this was really interesting, a visual to have. Another interesting visual that we found was a gaze plot. And so what you're seeing here, I know there's a lot of circles and a lot of lines, but so each individual color is one participant, and the larger the circle, the longer they looked in that particular area. The numbers in the circle indicate the path that in which they looked for task 3. So once again, what you're seeing here is kind of this interesting note of not many people were looking at the climate snapshot portion of CAnVAS to get their answers for the various questions in task 3. So this was really important to note, and a good visual of that statistical data that we were seeing as well. So along with efficiency, we ended up also looking at effectiveness. And so what I did for effectiveness with the 9 different questions, the percent of participants that answered the question correctly. And so from this, we found that task 1 was the most effective, meaning that participants answered that or those group of questions more correctly than others. And then we found that task 3 was the least effective from the statistical data and efficiency, and then in the visuals that you show, or that I just showed previously. Intuitively, this makes sense because participants would have had to plot the climate snapshot portion at the bottom in order to get the correct answer for these questions. And so once again, this required participants to click on the box and whisker data to display the spatial data that we wanted them to look at. And so the final metric of usability that we looked at was satisfaction. And so satisfaction, I was able to go through all of the interviews that I collected, transcribe them, and do a process known as thematic coding. And so I went through and looked for various themes throughout the data. I had a code coder for user reliability as well. And so what was found is that all 15 participants said that they would use CAnVAS or have one of their staff members use CAnVAS in their work setting. And also from this, so we were able to find a few recommendations that we eventually used within this new version of CAnVAS that you got a sneak peek of a few minutes ago. And so one recommendation was adding instructions to the website. We kind of just let participants have free reign. They could click whatever they wanted. And so they thought it would be helpful to have some sort of instructions on what they were displaying, what that would show if they were to click on a certain button versus others. That pop-up information that appears when you hover over a box and whisker plot, participants would have liked to see a larger font when that material hovers over the decadal interval. Include more climate variables when plotting data was another recommendation that we saw. In the version of CAnVAS that I used for eye tracking, there were only 3 climate variables. And as you saw earlier, many more have been added. So we have checked that box on that recommendation. And then also more information about RCPs. Some of the stakeholders that I was working with were not familiar with RCPs and the differences between 4.5 and 8.5 and what those differences meant. And so just having more information about that would be helpful for CAnVAS users in the future. And so ultimately, the aim of this work was to verify that CAnVAS is appropriate for stakeholder use, so those stakeholders being in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And with this, we also wanted to verify the usability, so the effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction of CAnVAS, and gain that user feedback. Since we weren't able to do that with undergraduates, they weren't our end user, we wanted to make sure that we were designing a tool that these biologists would use within their species status assessment writing. And then the results provided information about changes that stakeholders would like to see, which we thought was really beneficial. And then we also used a novel co-production approach throughout this entire process. So from the very beginning, we incorporated those in the Fish and Wildlife Service in order to properly develop a tool that was going to be used by them in the future. And so we thought using this co-production approach was very helpful and very collaborative throughout the entire process as well. And so kind of some implementation of CAnVAS that we're seeing right now and potentially where it could go in the future. This tool could be used for tribal planning and has been used in a workshop that Corey did not too long ago. And so Corey worked with USET, and with tribal nations, they tend to plan for 7 generations of the future when it comes to climate change and climate impacts. And so providing this tool was able to provide a little scope into that planning in the future. But also we want to acknowledge that this is not the only tool that could be used in the future. There are many more. So this is just one helpful resource for these tribal nations that they could use. Also, I have actually implemented using CAnVAS in a lab at Auburn University. And so we recently developed an introductory weather and climate course. And so I structured a lab around CAnVAS to help students understand exactly how climate change is going to be impacting endangered species in the future. What does climate look like if we're plotting certain data on maps, things like that, to kind of get students centered with understanding distributions of data spatially versus temporal data, things like that. So that's been really exciting, and it could be developed and used in other lab courses at other universities as well. And then also I structured a pre and post assessment around this lab to understand knowledge gains with participants who are using this lab. And so the future of CAnVAS starts right now, I feel like. So the framework is ready to go. You saw the link from Corey earlier. And so the link is included there, and I'm sure probably it'll get disseminated out to everybody. And it could be updated with newer projections, such as CMIP6. And then there's also potential for additional data sets. There are aquatic species who are on the endangered species list. So incorporating more aquatic variables such as salinity, and also sea level rise was a um, big climate variable that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stakeholders mentioned time and time again. And so incorporating that in an additional data set could be beneficial. And also land use and development in the species native range, according to like urban sprawl and things like that. So with that, I think we probably have a little bit of time for questions, but Corey and I both appreciate your time and appreciate you coming here and listening to us today. And yeah, thank you.
Haven, just a quick technical thing. Could you go back? We all had a lag on one of your slides where you were talking about the boxes that people were looking at. I'm trying to remember the areas of interest slide. Yeah, if you keep going back, keep going back. There we go. That one, that was the one that folks had messaged in, and I agreed we couldn't see it when you first swapped over to it. So there's the requested slide.
Awesome.
Thanks,
yeah.
Thanks, Haven. Go ahead and leave that up there, Haven. Corey has just been busy answering questions, typing out answers for you in the Q&A. If anybody has a question that they'd like to ask out loud, again, I'll remind you of that raise hand feature that's down in the middle of your bar. Or feel free to type it into the Q&A, and Corey and Haven can go ahead and grab it as well. While those questions come in, Haven, I just, out of a curiosity and interest in science communication too, I'm curious about what you think about the connection between most people having graduate degrees and most people looking at the box and whisker plots versus the maps themselves. Would you expect some differences if that demographic changed?
Yeah, that's a great thought. I don't really know if I would expect any sort of difference, because right now we also, in this version that I tested with stakeholders, once again, we gave them kind of just no instructions of how to display this climate snapshot. So technically they didn't know that they could click on this box plot to show the climate snapshot. So I think that was probably a bigger indicator, like the lack of instructions, more so than like a demographic versus another. But that is an interesting thought too. Yeah.
Yeah, us graduate degree folks, we love a box and whisker, but outside people do not like them. Jessica has a question in here. She asks, for now we are able to select a single area. Will there be any updates to allow us to enter multiple points to extract data from multiple locations? Who wants to grab that one?
Yeah, I can take this. Yeah, that's a really good question. And actually going back to the initial discussions we had about the CAnVAS tool, that was an idea that was maybe on the wish list, is that instead of just picking a single point, you could either upload a shapefile or have a polygon, or at least multiple points to look at. What we decided as we were doing the development and evaluation and the project went on is that we didn't want to throw too much into the interface all at once, knowing this was kind of the introductory version of it. But again, with the framework that we've talked about and we hope others can use and build on, I think that would be a great feature to add, is that you could explore average conditions over a wider region, or compare one point, say, in the eastern end of species range with the western side. So yeah, that's not something we ended up doing, but I love the idea. It's definitely something we thought of.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks, Jessica. Carrie.
Oh, I don't think I can. Yeah, I'll just ask real quickly. Does this offer any opportunity for considering how one might provide user support now that you've got the tool developed using its eye tracking, and or have you given some additional thought to that? Yeah, either using eye tracking or otherwise, what kind of user support might be good for this
So
tool.
by user support, do you mean like as people are using the tool, like how they can get help with, if they're not sure what to do with it or how to, I guess, yeah. So one thing we did, and this was actually informed by Haven's eye tracking results and some of the interviews that she did. I'll share my screen again, but we added in a FAQ page. So it includes some basic information about the tool and the data that we're looking at, but also answers to some of the questions that we commonly got that, throughout the development process. The other thing that we've included is these kind of yellow bars that include at least navigational guides through the tool. So again, one of the findings Haven had early on is that people were finding their way to these graphs and not understanding how to get the maps to load below that. So we've got the guides that include that information. Again, knowing our results from PineMap that showed people tended to not read that information, we're not sure if it's going to be useful for everybody, but hopefully it's at least useful for some folks as they're using the tool for the first time.
Thanks, Corey. Thanks, Carrie. Time for one last burning question, if anybody has one out there. Otherwise, I'm sure Corey and Haven are going to put their emails somewhere. They're pretty easy to find online. So if you have any questions, I'm sure you'll be able to find them there. In closing, I just want to go ahead and thank everybody who turned in. We had 107 people logged in at one stage, so thank you for spending your afternoon with us and learning more about this tool. I also want to let you know that our next science seminar in March is Climate-Driven Changes in Land Management Practices and Wildland Fire Smoke in the Southeast with Science to Action Fellow Megan Johnson. I'm going to go ahead and throw those links in the chat as well as a link to our newsletter. If you subscribe to the newsletter, you will never miss a seminar or any of the other really important events, publications, and other features that we have in that newsletter as well. Once again, thanks everybody, and a special thank you to Corey and Haven. Congratulations on the release of the tool. Not only super useful, but fun to use. I have been playing with it secretly while you were talking about it. I encourage everybody to check out those links and go ahead and start playing around with that data as well. Otherwise, thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you for the next science seminar.